At Balchem Animal Nutrition and Health, we strive every day to deliver results you can see in your animal's productivity and your bottom line. From a smooth transition into the milking string for your fresh cows, to a happy welcome home from your furry friend. From a strong start in your poultry flock, to consistent weight gains for your finishing hogs. We expect to earn your business and your trust with our people, our products, and our science. Our people have an intense passion for your animals and your success. You can count on us for honest, candid advice and practical solutions for your toughest challenges. As the global leader in choline production, chelation, and encapsulation technology, we take our obligation to you and to the environment seriously. Our products are backed by the most extensive and thorough research portfolio, while our business is committed to advancing environmental sustainability and animal welfare. In the end, it all comes down to results. Balchem delivers real results you can count on, results that exceed your expectations, and results that bring true value to your bottom line. Leading the charge to meet the nutritional needs of ruminants, monogastrics, and companion animals, Balchem offers a growing portfolio of nutritional products and a dedication to innovation and industry sustainability. Balchem is here to solve today and shape tomorrow.
Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Sorrell, Director of Global Marketing for Balchem, and I'll be your moderator today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the next installment of Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series. Today's Real Science webinar is a continuation of our discussion on social responsibility, started in September with Dr. Frank Midlerner, as we look more closely at sustainability and moving toward net zero emissions throughout agriculture. Today, we will take the next step in the conversation with Dr. Nina von Keyserlingk from the University of British Columbia with her talk titled, Animal Agriculture, Renewing Our Social License. This topic is sometimes uncomfortable since we will be focusing in on consumer perceptions and how they may be right or wrong, perceive the job we're doing in animal welfare. This is the time to ask questions in a safe environment that maybe you wouldn't feel comfortable asking in an open forum, and really focusing on understanding the perceptions that may seem very different from our own. So please enter this with an open mind toward growth, opportunity, and the potential for understanding. I would now like to introduce Dr. Nina van Keyserlingk. Nina is a professor at the University of British Columbia, but her desire to care for animals began at a very young age while growing up on a beef ranch in British Columbia. She completed her undergraduate studies in agriculture sciences at UBC and her master's in animal science at the University of Alberta. She returned to Vancouver to complete her PhD in animal sciences at the University of British Columbia. Nina joined the UBC Animal Welfare Program after obtaining several years of experience as a research scientist working for the animal feed industry and was appointed as NSERC Industrial Research Chair in 2008. She is recognized internationally for her research on care and housing for dairy cows and calves. Her studies have focused on the under-researched areas, including behavior, housing, and management, and how these contribute to the health and welfare of dairy cattle. We're happy to have her join us for this discussion that's very important and perhaps a bit difficult. Dr. von Keyserlingk, the floor is now yours.
So first of all, thank you to Balchem and for the opportunity to talk today. And as Scott said, some of the things that I'm going to talk about are going to make many people very, very uncomfortable. But my goal is, I guess, after being in this business now for close to 20 years as an academic working in the field of animal welfare, what I realized a long time ago is that if we don't talk about things, we tend to get into more trouble than if we don't talk about them. So I just want to say that there's a few changes in the slides. I took that prerogative. I sent them yesterday, but of course this morning when I got up super early to go through them again, I just tweaked a few things. So I told Stephanie that I would send an updated version, but there's just a couple minor things. So to begin, I just want to talk, just go back before I move to the next slide, is I added this sentence: science can tell us what the possibilities are, but it can't tell us what we ought to do. And that really is, I think, for me, it speaks to the heart of the whole issue of the social license. And this tension that we have now is in agriculture. We have relied on two things to move us forward. One is tradition. You know, this is an age, you know, working the land, caring for animals is as old as time. And so we have these practices that this is what we've done, this is what we've always done. And I was recently interviewed by a reporter, and you know, I was talking about growing up on a beef cattle ranch, and I said something about the fact, you know, I've castrated thousands of calves in my lifetime as a kid. The difference between now as a 57-year-old adult and a kid growing up on the farm doing what my dad told me to do is that I would never castrate an animal now without pain meds. It's because I've learned a little bit more. Science has helped us with that. It has shown that some of these practices are painful. There are other things that we do, you know, driven by science, but we don't necessarily get acceptance by society. And those are the tough ones. And those are the ones that I'm actually going to talk to a little bit about today, where we have this tension. So where did we start? You know, I've just got two books up here. You may or you may not know them. The one on the left is called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. It was published in 1906. It was really a story about some of the harsh conditions that and the exploitation of immigrants coming into the United States. It was about sort of socialism and things like that. But what Upton Sinclair did is a lot of the story was through the meatpacking industry, and described some of the conditions for the workers, but also the unsanitary conditions, and really brought light to some of the challenges around the slaughter industry. And it's interesting, here we are in COVID-19, and not so much now, but at the beginning, you know, with some of the challenges with the slaughterhouses, you know, a lot of the things that were brought up in the jungle came, you know, were talked about in the media again in 2020. So here was a book that brought forward some of the challenges with sort of the meat industry in the United States. And then we've got Animal Machines by Ruth Harrison, who was just a normal, run-of-the-mill, middle-aged woman who didn't know anything about agriculture, who started asking questions about where her food came from. And this was in 1963, 62, 63, that she started asking questions and was told time and time again, don't worry about it, everything is fine, animal agriculture's got things under control. She went and visited some farms, and she saw chickens in cages, veal calves in these dark, low ceiling barns, and was just appalled. This book was published in 1964, became almost an instant bestseller, and really was the beginning of what we call now sort of the call for science about how farm animals are cared for. And you know, and what we saw then by the sort of the 70s were a lot of the introduction of laws in Europe about how animals should be cared for. So this disconnect started, and it hasn't stopped. We saw a lot of discussion and criticism about animal agriculture, the whole CAFO industry with these larger farms, concentrated animal feeding operations, where farms, particularly beginning in the United States, but we're seeing some of this now in other parts of the world, where because of economics to some degree, because economies of scale results in greater efficiencies, as you saw these larger and larger farms, and the public started asking questions. This became even more center stage when individuals like Michael Pollan, in his bestseller book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, was published, and this is just a quote from that book. These are places where the subtleties of moral philosophy and animal cognition mean less than nothing. Indeed, where everything we've learned about animals, at least since Darwin, has been simply put aside. To visit a modern CAFO is to enter a world that, for all its technological sophistication, is still designed on 17th century Cartesian principles. Animals are treated as machines, production units, incapable of feeling pain. This really went to the heart of a lot of the discussions, and those that working in agriculture, I mean, this hurt big time, because people in agriculture worked their entire lives to care for the animals and trying to do the best thing, trying to incorporate science. And here was a popular press book that many people that knew nothing about agriculture read and started raising these questions. So the whole thing about sort of these factory farms was really at the farm level, but since then we've also seen lots and lots of criticism at sort of what I call at the individual animal level. So this is just a picture of a bus in the UK. This was in 2018. There was a movement that that basically bought advertising on all the city buses within London. And they had ones focused on pigs, others for chickens, and also for the dairy. But here, this was on the back of the bus, and it said, clipping piglets' teeth and cutting off their tails without pain relief is common in the meat industry. Many male piglets are also castrated without anesthetic. And I was sent this photo and from somebody in Brazil that had said, oh, did you see this? What was happening? We're also seeing the dairy industry the dairy industry for the most part has been, not as much at the center of the discussion as, let's say, pigs and particularly laying hens. I think in large part, those two industries have really been at the forefront because of this issue of restriction of movement. And the fact that, people get really, really wiggly when they start seeing animals in confinement. This, however, is, and I don't think the dairy industry, I'm going to be so bold as to say, is we are not ready for this discussion. But believe me, it's coming, and it's coming really, really fast. So this is on a billboard in Australia, and where it says, killed for his mother's milk, standard dairy practice. Calves are separated from their mothers so soon after birth, so her milk can be sold for profit. Males are killed, and females are used to replace their spent mothers. We've seen I've seen similar sort of advertisements like this in Europe. In Ireland, there's a big push now. Scandinavia, there's a big push. And we also see it on occasion here now. So we have this huge disconnect, and we've got this growing questions that are driven in large part, and I'm going to call them sort of more the animal rights movement, that are calling for change. And so the public and the consumer are left with these opposing views. On the one hand, agriculture continues to tell them, don't worry, we've got this under control. On the other hand, they see all these social media images and all these things, and who do I believe? Because in the mind of the consumer, we have this vision of, this is just a picture of a very large dairy, but the picture that they have in their minds is probably, when they're asked, and I'll show you some evidence about what does a dairy actually look like, they actually see cows on pasture, and yes, they see calves with their cows on pasture. There's some that say, look, they have the image of the old McDonald's farm. Yeah, maybe, but I mean, if we have some time afterwards in the discussion, we can talk about that more, as we are seeing generational differences now in how they describe these farms. And we can get into that more, like I said, later. So from a definitional perspective, to maintain a social license, it is incumbent that practices are in step with evolving community values. And really, this is the heart at what I'm trying to get at, is when we talk to the community, when we talk to the thoughtful person on the street, the person who we really, really want them to believe in food animal agriculture, where are their values, and are they very, very different than agriculture's values? And what are these disconnects? Can we understand these disconnects? And what can we do to try to move forward? To start out, I just want to give just a background of my own positionality, because I think so much of this comes from where we come from. As Scott said at the beginning, I grew up in the beef cattle industry. I worked in the feed industry for 7 years. I do spend most of my time working in dairy. In large part, this is a picture of the UBC dairy. It's 270 cow dairy. We have about 11,000 kilo herd average. It's a bit of a weird looking barn for many people because the feed alleys are on the outside, because we have 17 groups of 12 in this barn and one group of 48, so that we can do experiments. We do try to be in very open research facility. So every year we have an open house. We have people coming in and out. We try to be very much open to the public, open to farmers, and to try to encourage discussion. And I'll get back to this later. So how do we maintain our social license? I talked about this disconnect, and I would argue that this disconnect is growing. So what are the options that we have? We can educate the public. And this is really what I believe up until now has been agriculture's, the number one thing that we rely on. And I'll bring this up a number of times, but even my own father, I lived about 300 miles or 500 kilometers east of Vancouver. Can't tell you how many times he said, Nina, you just got to educate those people in Vancouver. Everything we do is perfect. Meanwhile, like I said, we never use pain mitigation for dehorning or castration or something, because that just wasn't done in the 70s. But there was this belief that as long as we can convey our values to those that we want to support us, that as long as we do that, then surely they will accept our values and buy our products. I'm then going to talk about some work that we've done with engaging the public, and then I guess sort of a call to arms is where I really believe animal agriculture has to start if we're going to start engaging in these conversations. So what about educating the public? I'm a scientist, I have graduate students, so when we are faced with questions like this, we come up with a research question, and then we decide that then we go out and undertake a study. So Beth Ventura was a PhD student of ours who was interested in the social sciences. And just to speak about the social sciences, this is something that I've been humbled by as after nearly 20 years of working in animal welfare. The reason animal welfare exists is because society is asking questions. So for the first 15 years of my life, I did lots and lots of research on cow comfort, feeding behavior, health, all these sort of things of cows, and trying to make their cows' life better. But at the end of the day, if we're going to really move forward, we also need to understand the people side of this. So this is understanding farmer attitudes, it's understanding caregiver attitudes, it's understanding people who work for what I call the allied industries, their attitudes, but also the public. And the public is because, like I said earlier, we need the public on side if we're going to maintain, some sort of animal agriculture industry. And don't forget the definition of sustainability is economically viable, environmentally friendly, and socially acceptable. So Beth decided that she was going to ask this question: does learning about current dairy cattle care practices change perceptions? So the first thing she did is she took 50 people who, just so you see here, these are bicycles. This is one of our open house days. We had over 800 people tour the facility that day, and a whole bunch of them came by on their bikes. Beth asked for 50 volunteers to participate in the study, and she took individuals who had never been on a dairy before. That was one of her inclusion criteria. And she also wanted people who ate dairy. And so she asked questions, and she got her 50 people. And the first thing she did before she did anything else, well, after they signed the consent form, was to give them a test. Because what she was trying to test was, if we actually educate people about dairy farming, then surely they'll have more confidence in the dairy industry. So she asked 5, and some of you are going to laugh. These are pretty simple questions, okay? So, but again, we're dealing with an uninformed stakeholder. So we had 50 people. The first question was, a dairy cow needs to have a calf to produce milk. And only 29 of the 50 people got this right. The next question was, dairy cows in British Columbia are routinely tied in their stall in the barn. British Columbia, the province that I live in, we have about 470 farms and we only have about 4 tie stalls left. So the answer to that was no, or false. The next question was, all dairy cows in British Columbia are allowed access to pasture. Again, the answer to this is that we are almost exclusively a zero grazing industry. So no, most cows are not allowed access to pasture. The next question was, how many days after birth does a dairy calf typically stay with its mom? 0 days, 1 week, 1 month, never separated. And we only had about 25% that got this right, which actually tells me that I think nobody really had a clue. They just guessed, okay? And then the last question was, which best describes what most adult cows are typically fed on dairy farms: milk, grass, or premixed feed? And the answer to that is C. The next thing she did is she asked them, what are the things that concern you about dairy farming? And the number one thing that was brought up was feed. And as Beth said to me when we were discussing this, she said, Nina, nobody actually said this, but I felt like they thought that we just feed them nuclear waste or something. Everybody brought up concerns about the feed. A lot of people from these, and these are these 50 individuals, spoke about their concerns about whether or not the cows had access to pasture or the outdoors. They said things like, I have this feeling that they're not allowed to. I hope they're allowed to go outside. Many spoke about behavioral restriction. And this doesn't surprise me, again, for the reasons that I said earlier, is that behavioral restriction is something that I think many people in the public have been sort of a little bit sensitized to because of so many pictures to do with the hen in the cage, the sow in the gestation stall. A lot brought up the issue of abuse. And this was not something that was surprising to us, because about 3 months before we did this study, we had the biggest undercover video in Canada, an expose on dairy, and it was just down the road from us. And it was huge. It was on the media for weeks on end. And it was really in the heart of the dairy industry where this happened. So then the question was, how confident are you that dairy cattle have a good life? And so this is before they went on the tour. She had 42% that said they were confident, 30% were neutral, and 28% said they were not confident. They then went on a tour of the facility, and they learned about dairy cow. They learned they had stations that were devoted to each of the areas where these questions had been. So in theory, we were going to educate them. And indeed, we did educate them. Before the tour, they got about, on average, 3 out of 5 right. And after the tour, they got 4 out of 5 right. So we had educated them. After the educational tour, some perceptions did improve. So here was somebody that said before going on the tour, I'm concerned about humane treatment, cramped living conditions, access to grazing. After, the animals seem very well cared for. The practices on this farm seem very ethical. But some perceptions worsened. Here was somebody that said before, I never had any concerns. And after said, I would still prefer to see animals grazing in the fields, eating the grass, and calves not separated so quickly from their mother. She then asked them, how confident are you that dairy cattle have a good life? So just to remind you, before we had 42% that were confident, 30% neutral, 28% not confident. So if education works, what we should hopefully see is sort of the spinning of this to the right. So we should hopefully increase the confidence level. That did not happen. We now went from 24% being confident, a huge increase in the number of people now who were sitting on the fence, and a slight increase in the people that were not confident. Overall, participants were very pleased to see high level of attention and care about cattle. And this is what Beth said came back. They were just so amazed at the people caring for the animals. They were super, super happy to see how great the feed looked and that the cows seemed to love this. But in actual fact, they were shocked about cow-calf separation and the lack of pasture outdoor access. When we educate in agriculture, we tend to talk about the stories that we're proud of. We don't talk about the things that we don't know how to talk about. And this is a great example of, you know, how often do we show pictures of cows on pasture, but we don't tell them that, you know, in Canada, less than 15% of cows have routine access to pasture. In the US, it's probably about the same, 15 to 20% maximum. Many cows will never, ever see a blade of grass. We don't tell them that in order to produce milk, the cow has to have a calf. And God forbid, we don't tell them that we take the calf away right away, because I think in our heart of hearts, we don't know how to talk about that. This is the picture that they have, you know, and it is so very different than what we do. And this is the risk. And the more we alienate the customer, our thoughtful person on the street, the greater the risk we have to losing our social license. And you know, when it comes to dairy, there are a lot of other products out there, almond milk, oat milk, all of these things that, you know, people, you know, we no longer live in a society where, at least in North America, you know, the majority of people have enough money to buy food. And I know that some families struggle more than others, but we're in a situation here where, you know, we're no longer in the 1930s. We live in 2020 and people have choice. So what about engaging with the public? Which is very different than educating the public. And here I'm going to talk about a couple examples from dairy, and I've been also doing a little bit more work on the pig side these days. So first of all, a good news story. I think we need to do a better job of talking about those stories that really are good news stories. And also, you know, as scientists, I think we have not done a good enough job in actually communicating our science to the general public. And this is a story of Emily McConaughey, was an undergraduate who did a study with me looking at the mechanical brush, and we did a motivation test where we taught cows how to, we clicker trained them like dogs and to push a weighted gate. And Emily then tested the cows, first of all, how much weight would they push to access feed after being milked. And let me tell you, cows will push a lot of weight to gain access to the TMR. They love the TMR. And then what she did is she changed the position of the gate, and she put the weighted gate in to see how much cows would access, how much they would push to access a mechanical brush. She also did a third step to this study where we actually removed the brush to see whether or not cows would actually push the weighted gate to access empty space. What I can tell you right now is they don't want to work for access to more space. These are all freestall house cows. What I can tell you is that cows will push as much weight to access a mechanical brush as they will to access fresh feed after milking. We published this paper in open access, gold open access in Biology Letters. And it was an interesting experience for me because what I didn't, well, two things. One, when Emily submitted the paper, she read the instructions to the authors in great detail. And one of the author instructions was if you had a really cool picture of your study, you could upload that and the journal would consider putting it on the front cover. And then the other thing that they do is they make available the titles about a week before it actually goes to publication. And I had no idea that they do this, but reporters can access that material, and they have to sign their life away because they're on an embargo, who can then read the paper, get their interviews of the scientists, and then the day the paper's published, they can also then publish their work. And so this actually was quite enlightening for me, because I'm sure you guys have been driving down the road and some reporter will go today in the Lancet, they published this work. And I always wondered, how do they write their stories so quickly? Well, this is how they do it. Anyhow, I got called by a bunch of reporters, and one of them was the New York Times. And this paper went viral. So it was featured in the New York Times. It was featured in numerous newspapers all over the world. And so this is an example of how you can tell, these good news stories, how science can help us. Those of you that speak Dutch can read this, but anyways, what happened when we published this paper, this is a faculty member, my understanding is, I had a few Dutch students at the time who very rights leaning, who posted a tweet in the Netherlands, basically chastising farmers for not having mechanical brushes. This became the 9th most trending tweet, or actually what happened is farmers uploaded pictures, because I guess most farmers in the Netherlands have brushes, uploaded all their pictures on the Netherlands, uploaded all their pictures of their brushes to their Twitter accounts, and they actually forced her to shut down her Twitter account. This conversation was the 9th most trending tweet in the Netherlands the Saturday after the paper was published. So coming back to, opening barn doors, these are things that are super important. And what I'm not saying is that we shouldn't open the barn doors and allow people to come in. Absolutely, I think farm tours and all of that should be really important. However, I've had many conversations with farmers who say, yeah, I open the barn doors and people come in, and when I ask them questions afterwards, they say, oh, nobody had any questions. And we assume that means that they are okay with everything that we did. I think it's a very, very risky assumption. And what I say to farmers when they talk about farm tours, I absolutely encourage them. But when you take people through the tour, don't ask them if they have any questions. That puts an uninformed stakeholder on the spot, and they then have to figure out, well, I don't really understand anything, and I don't want to sound stupid, so what am I supposed to say? So I say nothing. Instead, ask them, is there anything on my farm that you absolutely didn't like? And then we can have a conversation about it. It's, for me, I often think, when I go through some sort of particle accelerator, and I went years ago on a tour of this, I didn't know what to ask the person. I don't know anything about that. And that's the same thing here. We need to engage, we need to reflect, and we need to do research, and we need to improve. In terms of the reflection, one of the things that I've been trying to do is also to get people to imagine the ideal dairy farm or imagine the ideal pig farm and get views of the American citizens. So, to get a better understanding of, when we're talking about the thoughtful person on the street, what do they talk about when I ask them, describe your ideal pig farm or your ideal dairy farm. So I'm going to show you the results of a paper that we published in 2017, where we asked just general thoughtful people, what I hope are thoughtful people on the street, via an online survey. We just asked a simple question. We asked, what do you consider to be an ideal pig farm, and why are these characteristics important to you? We did not mention the word sustainability. We did not mention the word animal welfare. All we did is ask people they had a text box and to type away how they described this. There's actually a whole area of scholarship behind this. We did thematic analysis on the results, and this is what we found. So the number one concern when people were asked about an ideal dairy farm is one where. The most of the responses focused around animal welfare. And I'm just going to give you a quote, and these quotes are an individual voice, but they represent the type of quote that was very common within that theme. So in terms of animal welfare, the pigs have room to roam and aren't trapped in pens. The use of cages should not be permitted. Interesting, the number two characteristic that came out was the business operation. Another aspect of perfect pig farm is the use of technology and automation. This will make the farm more efficient and more likely to keep the farm profitable. And at first, we thought, this is strange, the fact that they talk about the business operation, but in thinking about it, it makes absolute total sense, because how could you ever give a pig a good life if you're going broke? So, they're nuanced in their thinking. Naturalness came up, based on the principles of sustainability and harmony with nature. Ethical considerations, pigs are treated with dignity and kindness, not a place to, such as high priority in maximizing profits. And this speaks to, we see this in a number of places. We saw this on the dairy side and a number of other studies now, especially on the pig side that we've done. They expect the farmers to be experts in what they do. They absolutely recognize that, the duty of care is really important. So these are things that the public doesn't expect themselves to be experts. They expect the agriculture to be experts. But where they get uncomfortable is when they see these things that go against their own values, such as they absolutely see antibiotics being used, but only when needed. And this comes back to this duty of care. You are caring for the animals. You have a sick animals. You have an ethical responsibility to treat that animal. And if it needs antibiotics, then you should give it antibiotics. But what they don't want to hear about is prophylactic use of antibiotics. They don't want to hear about hormones being used to increase production. And then there was some discussion, although not as much as we had predicted initially, about the environment. And this person said, there is little sense in spoiling aquifers and other groundwater solely for the production of pig products. We did the same thing for dairy. I'm not going to go through all the quotes, but the four main themes that came up were, again, the cow. 60% of the comments revolved around the life of the individual cow. And they had things like, to have a good life, she needed access to pasture. Again, the number two characteristic was the business operation. And I think this speaks again to, the fact that they recognize that for a farmer to give an animal a good life, they can't be going broke. And then there was dairy products, and then a little bit about the environment. This is some work that we've been doing on pigs, looking at public attitudes. This is actually done in Brazil. I spent a short sabbatical in Brazil, and we did this with some Brazilian public. And this is interesting because socioeconomically, there's a country that is got lots of people who are more, I would say, are quite challenged in terms of their income status, those sort of things. And so we asked the question, in your opinion, how should pregnant sows be housed? There was a questionnaire, and then they had the ability to access video. We balanced the videos for the numbers as best we could for the number of pigs that were visible in the video. We tried to take the best quality or the best looking housing systems in terms of cleanliness, all that sort of stuff. And we showed the systems typical in Brazil. And then we asked, in your opinion, how should pregnant sows be housed? And so this is indoors in individual crates, I don't know, and indoor in group housing. And you can see a huge increase in the number of respondents that were in support of group housing. However, we did have a fourth option, and that was in another system. We did not describe that system, we just said in another system. And it was by, the one that was picked the most. And so this speaks to I think we need to be careful about coming up with alternative housing systems without having the public involved. And a really good example of that is the caged hen, where we have a system where, you know, we know that the battery cage is not working. There was millions and millions of dollars and euros and British pounds put into the enriched cage or the furnished cage, and this work was done in the sort of in the 80s. And so we've got these larger cage sized cages that have got nest boxes, perches, places to scratch themselves, all of these sort of things. And so here we have all this science that actually, from the bird's perspective, we could put a system in place that works for her. The thing is, nobody ever asked the public in 1980 what they thought of the furnished cage. And had they done so, we probably would have gotten back a very resounding, no, I don't like this system. And we would have had 20 years of being able to focus research on making cage-free system work well. And I know that there's lots of challenges with cage-free systems. But when you look at where retailers, you know, when they're talking about their promises, they very rarely talk about enriched cages. They talk about transitioning from cage systems to non-cage systems. Because remember, the public doesn't have context. And so I think this is something here where I'm not sure in the long run whether or not indoor group housing is going to be a system that in 50 years will resonate with societal values. So we know that there's some promise in engaging with the public. We can tell our good news stories, and we can also find from the public, garner information that can help us move forward as we look to identify sustainable solutions that resonate with the public. But what about leading the process? I would argue that animal agriculture up until now has spent a lot of the time just being reactionary, and rather than sort of leading the process and being part of the conversation. In my mind, though, in order to lead the conversation, the industries themselves, first of all, have to develop a vision for their industry. And so we've been doing some work now where with farmers, with veterinary groups, with different stakeholder groups, where we put them in a scenario where, okay, in order for your granddaughter or your grandson to take over this farm in 20 to 30 years, what are the things that you see should be resolved or put in place that they can farm without the same challenges that we have today? So we've been doing lots of focus groups. The idea with the focus groups is to build relationships, create dialogue, discuss and identify shared values, and begin to develop a vision for the industry and how this can be achieved. And when I talk to sort of more the grassroots industries, I often talk to them about, you know, the whole idea of professionalism and the way organizations work. Most organizations spend a lot of time doing things like strategic planning. You know, what is their mission? What is their vision? And, you know, what are the steps that they need to do in order to realize that vision? And I think this is, to me, something that's been lacking in animal agriculture, particularly at the individual farm, sort of farm industry level. So we did a study, we just published this, I think in the last month or two, in the Journal of Dairy Science, where we talked to 25 farmers in Western Canada about sort of the must-haves. So we tried to get them to look forward 25 years and, you know, what are the things that they need to have? And there was a large recognition that consumer confidence was important. The bigger the word, the more often it came up. They talked about management, quality, bedding, cow comfort, employees, prevention, these sort of things. And so, you know, this is the very first stab at this. You know, we were, when the facilitators, the focus groups, they all came back, and we had 7 of them. They struggled a little bit because it was very difficult for the farmers to project forward. They kept talking about sort of that what they really wanted to talk about was what was my problem of today. But at least this is a start of trying to do some of these things. I've also done this with veterinarians. This was at the Ontario Association of Bovine Practitioners. And we did this in two parts. We had the must-haves, and then we also talked about trying to get them to identify the leave-behinds. And so here, they wanted to leave behind lame cows, the use of hormones. These are the off-sync programs that when we talked about it a little bit more, that's what came out there. The issue of bull calves, these in the dairy industry, I think one of the big areas that is going to come, and this is going to come with cow-calf separation, is this recognition that, or the discussion around these surplus animals and what do we do with them. They are often the focus of undercover videos, and and there's parts of the world where most of these animals are killed within 2 weeks. In Canada, a lot of these bull calves end up in the veal industry. I saw the data the other day. Canadians don't eat veal very much anymore. So we're pushing these animals into an industry where the Canadian public has already actually said, look, I'm not interested in eating veal. So, there are growing discussions about dairy beef, but I think what's going to come at the same time is this bull calf conversation is not going to come by itself. It's going to come with the issue of cow-calf separation. And we have very little science around cow-calf separation. Our group published 2 systematic reviews a couple of years ago, and the science is weak on justifying to separate. So we actually did this for Dairy Australia. They commissioned us. They were under attack from a number of animal rights groups about this issue. They commissioned us to do a systematic review. I think truly believing that we would come to the table with a bunch of science that showed that separating cows and calves was the right thing to do. In actual fact, we couldn't do that. There are things like, mastitis, the a huge economic challenge for the dairy industry. What does the science of cow-calf contact show? Highly protective. You can reduce mastitis by just keeping the calf with the cow. Makes sense. The calf suckles the udder more often, so all those sort of things. So, this is an area where I've often said to farmers and industry professionals, this is an area that needs science, because I do believe that this conversation is going to keep coming. And look at it as like an insurance plan. In 20 years, you may be in a situation, or we may be in a situation where we have to keep cows and calves together. And hopefully we have some science to guide that process. Because right now, I couldn't even begin to tell you how to do that. We also did this work at the Pig Welfare Symposium in November of 2019, about a year ago, where we looked at 7 groups, 31 participants, and these were the pig people looking at sort of the must-haves, welfare. The use of technology was seen as a huge driver moving forward. And I do think, technology will be one of our best friends in moving forward and trying to improve the lives of animals on farms. Training, environment, care, worker, farm. And in terms of the leave behinds, the unattractive features, they were really, the issue of on-farm, the numbers of pigs that had to be euthanized, consumer education. They hoped, and I thought that was really cool. They hoped that the consumer education was something that they didn't have to worry about anymore. That, to me, this speaks to an alignment of values. So one of the things that we did with the pig industry in these focus groups is we also asked them to talk about how do they achieve that vision. Industry-led, they felt very strongly they needed to be at the center of this conversation rather than being reactionary. Research was super important to pave the way. Openness to change, engagement between consumers and the industry, and a recognition that they need to sit down and decide what our values are. And shared lessons learned within industry around the world, not to reinvent the wheel. And really, as an industry, pig industry, these individuals were saying we need to come up with minimum standards and we need to enforce those standards. So my take-home points are: one-way educational efforts are likely to fail. Sustained two-way engagement can help. And I really implore you, don't just respond to concerns. Animal agriculture really needs to be part of the conversation. It needs to lead the process, but it also needs to be open to change. But it needs to develop a collective vision and plan for how to achieve this. This is going to take a lot of courage, because I think this is also, to be successful, it needs to recognize that the public and the consumer are an important and key stakeholder. And so the closer we can have our practices that align with societal values, the more likely we're going to be able to retain the social license to do business. What are your must-haves for the future of your industry, and what must be left behind? And lastly, I just want to recognize the sponsors of the Animal Welfare Program, including the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, which is sort of equivalent to NIH in the US, and the various companies that support our program. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Before we get started answering questions, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer the questions submitted during today's presentation.
Every expectant mother knows that what she eats impacts her baby. And now research shows that is also true for our cows. Maternal consumption of ReaShure during late gestation had a positive effect on the in utero calf, setting her up for better health and potentially even higher milk production once she joins the milking string. Learn more at balchemanh.com/launch and launch your herd for life.
All right, as a reminder, you can continue to submit questions using the question pane on the attendee control panel. Dr. von Keyserlingk, the first question is, what's driving consumer change? Back in the 1930s, the consumers only 1 or 2 degrees away from agriculture themselves, and yet they understood the practices and had no issues with them. Yet over time, now this consumer, the consumer that we're facing today, they have a different opinion of what their expectations are. So what's driving that? And then what do you see going forward in terms of the evolution of the consumer preferences?
Okay, so I'll start with the first one. So what do I think is driving consumers? I think we're living in a space where we've got social media, we have access to information, we can have debates about whether or not that is true or not, but it is what it is. And so they are just more critical. They have the option to be more critical. And so they're asking questions. And I think what's happening is a lot of the driving is, you see this a lot there's 2 different ways that this is being realized. In Europe, we're seeing a lot more laws. We have the European Union Directive on Animal Welfare, which is, and laws for the most part represent societal values, and we can have debates about whether or not they're enforced or not, but so you've got more laws governing how animals will be cared for on farms. In North America, it's a little bit different. We have, in the United States, we have a lot of states that are passing sort of their propositions, the most famous one being the one in California in 2008, where animals shall not be housed in such a way that they cannot extend their wings fully, turn around 360 degrees, and not touch another animal or touch housing. And that really dramatically changed the egg industry in the United States, in California. But what's happening there generally across the United States is corporate America is getting involved. You've got different corporations who listen to their customers, who are basically, it's risk mitigation. And so they are concerned about what their customers are saying. And so I was recently talking to a milk processor who said, one of the #1 questions that they get from their general consumer is cow-calf separation, and they don't know what to say. And so these things are percolating in the background. We have a very strong animal rights movement, and we look back at when social change happens. The reason that women have the vote is because some women got out and, marched in the streets. This is, I'm not saying that what their tactics are always good, but they are forcing a conversation. And so I think, even just to come back to the generational issue, is we're seeing sort of the biggest voting group now are the millennials. And the millennials, you know, that are all coming up on 40 now are at the peak of their careers. They have disposable incomes and they're making choices.
All right, you mentioned the animal rights movements, and I don't know if it's a fair question for you or not, but we got some people out there that are just hell-bent on confessing our sins, right? And distorting reality. And should we address that? And if so, how?
I mean, I think the challenge that we have is, I mean, we need to be more transparent, because I would argue that animal agriculture is not transparent. We talk about the things that we are very proud of. We do not talk about the things that we're not proud of. And animal rights organizations have taken advantage of that. And so until we are actually open about some of these things, they will always have the upper hand, because they catch, you know, the consumer is totally caught blindsided. They see these pictures of, you know, dairy calves being, you know, dragged out of the pen and thrown into a wheelbarrow and, you know, hauled away to calf ranches and all that sort of thing. We don't talk about that. If we were to more talk about it and recognize that there's some things that we are not proud of that we need to work upon, then I think, I can't say it's going to take it all away, but at least the average consumer is not going to be caught off guard, because right now that's one of the biggest problems that we face.
I've got a few questions related to cost. I think there's a sincere desire by a lot of people to want to change some of these things to improve consumer perception and acceptance. But the belief is that these things may cost more, and maybe not if we come up with technologies, and perhaps things may actually get cheaper. But let's assume that it may cost more. Is the consumer willing to pay for that? And do you have any evidence to support that?
So the issue here becomes between what we call the consumer versus the citizen. Okay, so as a consumer, we walk into a grocery store and we basically vote with our wallet, and that's always been agriculture's criticism. Is, you know, we talk about improving practices, as you say, you know, they're unwilling to pay more. The thing is, I think that's a really risky argument to hold on to. It's saying, look, you know, we're not going to change until they're willing to pay more, because what you're doing is putting the sustainability of your industry on the shoulders of an uninformed client. An uninformed client that can actually has the option at some point to turn around and walk away and buy something else. When a consumer walks into a grocery store, they assume that, for the most part, that all the food is safe. And they assume that we've taken our duty of care seriously, and they assume that the practices are ethical. The challenge is that all of a sudden now, as a citizen, they're outside of the grocery store and they see these things and they're thinking, oh my goodness, you know, I didn't know that. Why is that? So I think this comes back to, what are the minimum standards? And what are those going to be? And how do we better align our industries with the values, better align the values that resonate with the public? In the US, what we saw, again, using the California example, is, you know, United Egg Producers put in millions of dollars in 2008 to tell the public that if this law passes, Proposition 2, if this passes, then eggs are going to become more expensive. Well, what happened is nearly 70% of the California public voted in favor of that. Is that how we should be making animal welfare laws? I don't think so. But that happened. And so those were people reacting as a citizen. The challenge with doing things like that, where if we don't narrow this gap, you're going to be in a situation where, God forbid, you know, what would happen if all of a sudden there was a law or proposition that came forward that says all cows should be on pasture? What do you think the public would do? Of course, the public would vote in favor of that. You and I both know there are certain times and certain environmental conditions where it's not conducive for cows to be outside or pigs to be outside or whatever. So we need to be careful with that argument. We need to accept that the right to do business, our social license, hinges on us continually moving forward and continually trying to get better. And I guess that's one of the things that I have, all my conversations with the thoughtful person on the street is that they don't expect agriculture to change overnight, but they expect agriculture to get better every day. And not just use, and that, it gets these nuances now, but this argument, well, I can only get better if you pay more, I don't think is going to fly in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Van Keyserlingk, I'm cognizant of the time. I've got time for one more question, and I think this is a nice one to end on. You shared a couple books early on in the presentation that showed the uglier side of animal agriculture. Do you have any books that you'd recommend that maybe sheds a more positive light, more true light on?
I don't.
And if not, maybe you should write one.
Yeah. I wrote one textbook or one book years ago, and I swore I would never write another book. No, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I mean, I spend a lot of time, there's a lot of books out there about, Food Inc., all of these ones that, bring out the sort of the challenges that animal agriculture has. I guess I just encourage people to have transparent conversations. Don't be afraid to say that there's something in your industry that you don't like. Because, I'm just going to end on a conversation that I had with a farmer because he was being attacked about cow-calf separation. And this was a farmer that was group housing his calves or pair housing his calves. And I said to him, rather than tell your critic that they don't understand, tell them that, I used to feed my calves only 4 liters of milk. I used to feed them out of a bucket. I used to individually house them. Science has shown me that calves actually drink 8 to 10 liters of milk a day. They like to be group housed. They're actually smarter. They do all these things. And in 25 years, if science can show me how to keep cows and calves together, I'm the first to be there. Much more in alignment with his critic.
Well, thank you, Nina, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com, and we'll forward them to you along with the unanswered questions from today's session. Balchem has recently launched an extension of the Real Science Lecture Series in podcast form. But this isn't just a boring podcast. You'll get to know top researchers like you've never known them before. Go behind the scenes and hear conversations that take place over a few drinks with friends. Join us at the Real Science Exchange as we discuss the hot topics in animal science and share a range of new ideas. Search for Real Science Exchange in your favorite podcast platform, and be sure to follow us and look for our 3rd episode, which will drop later tonight. The next Real Science Lecture Series webinar will be on December 1st. As we all look to 2021 with anticipation of better days, Dr. David Cole will look into his crystal ball and share some insight into the dairy markets. His talk, titled Transitioning a Black Swan to a Phoenix in the Global Dairy Industry, will take place on December 1st at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Visit balchemanh.com/realscience today for additional details and to register. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. Van Keyserlingk, thank you for joining us today.